Get out, you, a complete stranger parasite. Layla lashed out against me. Ignoring my surprise, she continued. This house is in my dad's name, and as his real daughter, I have the right to live here. You're just in the way, so could you leave now? Hearing this, I was momentarily stunned. But then I burst into laughter. Do you not know? I deliberately paused there. Layla, curious about what I'd say next, held her breath and stared at me intently. To the moving company staffs, who seemed confused, I instructed them to move all the items into a spare room since there weren't many. When Layla tried to sneak in amidst the mess, I stopped her with my hand. This house is in my name. You and I are strangers. Don't just walk in. When I said that, Layla's face turned red, and she shouted, "Who cares?" before storming off somewhere. I felt a surge of anger after being confronted like this so soon after Kevin's death. I was determined to make her regret it. I had finally raised in revolt. My name is Emma Turner, a 39-year-old piano teacher. My husband, Kevin, was 6 years older than me and an entrepreneur who ran his own company. We met through work and gradually nurtured our love. When we started considering marriage, Kevin confessed something. He had been married before. In his 20s, he married his then-girlfriend and had a daughter, Layla. However, his ex-wife's infidelity soon came to light. She spent a lot of money to her affair partner and racked up so much debt, leading Kevin to gain custody of Layla after she relinquished her parental rights. Layla, raised in a single-parent household for a while, didn't seem to lack anything, especially as his business was thriving. But as his wealth grew, so did Layla's selfishness. In middle school, she always demanded high-end cosmetics and wanted to dye her hair too flashy. Kevin said she never listened, no matter how many times he told her she shouldn't. Growing up as she was, Layla showed disgust when Kevin introduced me to her as his new partner when she was in high school. You? I'll never accept you as my mom. I have a beautiful mom and a rich, kind dad. That's all I need. Although Kevin hadn't told Layla about her mother's affair, she seemed to hold her beautiful mother in high regard. That's not necessarily a bad thing, though. Ultimately, Layla never accepted me, so we only got married after she turned 18, graduated high school and started working. I thought she was a grown-up by then, but I never imagined things would turn out this way. Kevin and I never wanted children of our own. To Kevin, Layla was his only child. And he feared what she might do if we had a child together, saying she wouldn't handle having a half-sibling well, as she even didn't accept me as her mother. As for me, being in my late 30s and hearing stories about raising their children from my friends, I doubted my suitability for child-rearing. Especially considering Layla's open hostility, I had no confidence in dealing with a child in a rebellious phase, real or imagined. So we agreed, no children for us, just a peaceful life together as a couple. That's how we got married. 2 years ago, after Layla turned 18 and started working, we got married, and since then, we lived ordinary days as a couple. But those peaceful days ended within those 2 years. Kevin was diagnosed with cancer. It was already in the late stage, and all we could do was prolong his life. I was so shocked I couldn't process anything, not even the prognosis or treatment plans. Before I knew it, Kevin was hospitalized and began treatment. Coming home to an empty house, I felt worn out. And then, someone appeared, adding to my troubles. Yes, that Layla. Technically, as Kevin's stepdaughter, she was related to me, but we never lived together, so I didn't feel much connection. It wasn't strange that a daughter would know where her father lived, but how did she know about Kevin's cancer? Dad has cancer, right? You're so out of it, he told me. Kevin must have told her that out of concern, but honestly, both Layla and I weren't really happy about that. However, Layla seemed to have something in mind and, with a sly smile, said this. I guess I have to look after you now, and of course, take care of Dad. You, his new wife, can't compare to me, his real daughter. Leaving me with those provoking words, she left. I immediately contacted Kevin and relayed the conversation. He apologized, saying, "I thought Layla had grown up. I'm sorry for causing you distress." Kevin wasn't to blame, and I wanted him to focus on his situation. Not wanting to burden a sick person, I replied cheerfully, "Don't worry, I'll handle her." But honestly, I wasn't confident. Already doubting my aptitude for parenting, how was I supposed to deal with someone openly hostile towards me? Besides, with nearly a 20-year age gap, could I, a 39-year-old, really connect with a 20-year-old Layla? These thoughts swirled in my head, leaving me exhausted. It's useless to overthink. For now, I'll just focus on work and supporting Kevin. With that thought, I tried to sleep. But worry for Kevin kept me awake. The next day, my students and their parents could tell something was wrong. Before I knew it, 6 months had passed. During this time, there weren't many changes in my job, and Kevin was trying to fight his illness, living each day to the fullest. However, one worrying issue persisted. That was Layla's presence, since she moved into the neighborhood half a year ago. I think I've lost over 10 pounds in these 6 months. Even now, as I held the baby in my arms, I couldn't help but wonder why I had to do this, furrowing my brow in doubt. The baby's name is Ashley. And, believe it or not, she's Layla's child. That makes me, by extension, Ashley's step-grandmother. Taking advantage of this, Layla often dumps Ashley on me. Half a year ago, Layla moved nearby, as she had declared. I initially thought she would be alone, but she arrived with Ashley, her biological daughter. After graduating high school at 18, Layla fell for a club promoter and spent most of her salary on him. Kevin had told me her mother was similar, so it seemed like a case of like mother, like daughter. But Layla's romance didn't pan out. She ended up pregnant and, surprisingly, even quit her job. It seemed like a convenient excuse to escape for someone who was always troublesome and selfish. Apparently, he caused a scene in front of his club, got some compensation, and now receives regular child support from him. That's why she had Ashley, but a few months later, she learned of Kevin's illness. Incredibly, Layla saw this as an opportunity. I mean, Dad's got loads of money, right? If I play nice now, maybe he'll leave me a big inheritance. I remember being shocked to hear Layla's voice talking like that to someone. A man, as far as I could tell from her phone conversations. But who it was didn't matter. It was clear Layla only saw her father as a cash cow. And she probably saw me, his spouse with a right to half of his estate, as an obstacle. I even caught her asking someone over the phone how a stepmother could renounce an inheritance. I couldn't bring myself to tell Kevin, who was fighting so hard to live. It would be too cruel for him. So, I kept quiet, trying to process it all by myself. Layla took advantage of my silence and started bossing me around more after moving. At first, it was just "I'm going to the bank, watch Ashley for a bit." But then it escalated to "I'm visiting Dad in the hospital," or "Ashley's dad insists he wants me to talk about her to him. He's suddenly interested in his daughter now." And so, I became her regular babysitter. Of course, without any compensation for it. I couldn't bring myself to ask for money, considering Ashley was my step-grandchild, and I was more afraid of something happening to her if I refused. Layla's demands escalated until she recently said like this: "I'm going on a trip with friends. Can you watch Ashley for about 3 days? You can, right? You're always home anyway." I'm home, yes, but only because my piano students come for lessons in the evening. I wanted to argue, but knowing Layla would just retaliate, I simply agreed. Ironically, I find Ashley so adorable. Despite thinking I couldn't handle childcare, the baby charms tickled my maternal instincts. But hearing about the trip gave me a headache. With significant expenses for Kevin's treatment each month, and furthermore, taking care of Ashley for 3 days would add to my costs. I've been covering all expenses for Ashley's diapers and formula. I didn't want to use Kevin's money for this since I decided to take on this myself, and initially, it wasn't too burdensome. But as costs rose, so did my stress. Sometimes, I'd catch myself wondering why I, as her step-grandmother, was doing what Layla, her mother, should be doing. Layla doesn't even recognize me as her mother. Yet she conveniently uses me like this. I can't say it doesn't upset me. Still, I did what I could for innocent Ashley, but I was reaching my limit. I planned to talk to Layla when she returned, to tell her to take responsibility for her daughter. But right after Layla left for her trip, I got a call from the hospital and rushed out. Arriving there, the busy nurses and doctors made it clear that Kevin's time was near. Sensing something, Ashley started crying, but the nurses told me not to worry. Kevin was already unconscious, and it didn't take long for his passing to be announced. His face was peaceful, though. They say a person's hearing lingers for a bit after death, so maybe Kevin departed peacefully, hearing Ashley's cries and my voice. That thought made me burst into tears. Kevin's wake went smoothly, but Layla was nowhere to be seen. I informed her of Kevin's passing right away, but her response was shocking. "Oh, really? But I've extended my trip and can't come back soon. You, as his spouse, can handle the funeral arrangements, and nobody will object. You're his wife on the family register, so take care of the rest. And take care of Ashley too," she said before hanging up. I wanted to scream, but with Ashley there, I somehow held it back. Kevin's relatives asked why Layla wasn't there, but fearing a commotion, I made up a plausible excuse about her trip extension. Even the time of the interment, Layla never showed up, and the only one who saved my nearly broken heart was Ashley. For a whole 2 weeks after Kevin passed away, Layla had vanished without a trace, ignoring all attempts to contact her. But then one day, when the doorbell rang and I answered it, there stood several robust, fresh-faced men, who introduced themselves as movers. Peeking behind them, I saw Layla, grinning slyly. "Parasites which is a stranger need to get out," she snapped at me. Ignoring my shock, Layla continued. "I've given up the apartment I was living in, and starting today, I'll be living here. After all, this house is in Dad's name, and as his biological daughter, I have the right to live here. You're just in the way, so can you leave right now?" Hearing this, I was taken aback for a moment, but then burst into laughter. "Do you not know?" I deliberately paused there. Layla, curious about what I'd say next, held her breath and stared at me intently. Since I, her usually docile stepmother, suddenly started laughing, she must have felt more terror than surprise. I instructed the bewildered movers to temporarily store all the stuff in an empty room since there wasn't much. As Layla tried to sneak in amidst the confusion, I stopped her with my hand. "Do you think it's okay to enter someone's house without permission? This house is in my name. We're not legally related through adoption, and our family registers are different, so technically, we're strangers. Besides, you've never acknowledged me as a mother, right? So, don't start acting like a daughter now, especially after using me as a convenient babysitter and looking down on me all this time." Saying this, Layla looked frightened. Unperturbed, I continued, "So, your trip is over, I guess I can give Ashley back to you. After all, you are her mother, so take care of her properly." Angered, Layla yelled, "Who cares?" and stormed off, leaving Ashley behind. The movers looked on with puzzled expressions. It was outrageous how Layla tried to move in without any notice right after Kevin's death, cursing at me like that. I felt a rising anger within me. I was determined to make her regret it. I had finally decided to revolt. In the end, Layla just dumped her belongings in my room and never showed her face again. I heard she had given up her apartment, but where she was living and how remained a mystery. However, my hands were full with taking care of Ashley. Fortunately, Ashley was familiar with my face since she was a baby and had seen me almost every day, so she was very attached to me. I had a stock of milk and diapers, and several friends who had experience with childcare gave me advice after I explained the situation. I had no choice but to brace myself. Since things had come to this, I would take full responsibility for Ashley until the matter was settled. I've decided to do so. During lessons at home, Ashley would sleep peacefully, seemingly comforted by the sound of the piano. Some parents, aware of my situation, even offered to watch her while I was teaching. News about Layla had somehow leaked out, and Kevin's relatives occasionally came to check on us. When I had to leave for lessons or work, someone would take turns watching Ashley. Although Kevin was gone, the network he left behind and the support of the warm-hearted people around me allowed me to live a peaceful life. Then, 2 months after Layla disappeared, she suddenly reappeared before me. She was accompanied by a police officer and a child welfare worker, falsely accusing me of kidnapping Ashley. The police officer explained that they couldn't take action until they verified the situation. Layla was yelling, "Arrest her quickly. She stole my child. Just because she doesn't have her own kids, she's so presumptuous," and to the child welfare worker, "Isn't this your job? Hurry up and take the child away from this woman." The police officer talked to me calmly, so I explained the whole situation to him. The police officer looked a bit astounded. It seemed they realized that Layla was acting out of spite and frustration. The child welfare worker tried to calm Layla down, but her words fell on deaf ears as Layla's anger had peaked. Realizing this was going nowhere, I boldly stated, "You are the one who dumped Ashley on me. All the neighbors know it, as do Kevin's relatives. You can't claim ignorance after running away that day, and calling the police might even be considered obstruction of justice, don't you think?" I said this nonchalantly, and the police officer nodded in agreement. Technically, it might be more accurate to call it a false accusation, especially since Layla had even filed a complaint against me. But I figured Layla wouldn't understand the complexities, so I simply told her she was lying and obstructing the officer's duty. The word obstruction of justice seemed familiar to Layla, and she began to falter, so my approach was highly effective. I continued to explain further. A mother who dumps her infant on someone else to go on a trip, and then does something like this, seems more problematic, don't you think, officer? I said this, turning my gaze to the child welfare worker, and it seemed Layla finally grasped the situation. "Well, fine. I'll let you off this time." I thought to myself, what is she forgiving? And the police officer started to talk to Layla about having a discussion at the police station. It made sense. After filing a false complaint, they couldn't just say, "Okay, dismissed," and be done with it. Layla, pale-faced, turned to us as the child welfare worker added something that seemed like the last straw, and she completely panicked. "It's not my fault. It's all her fault." She kept repeating nonsensical things, but the police officers said thank you to me and left for the time being. A younger officer who seemed like a subordinate came later and took a brief statement from me, but my innocence was quickly cleared thanks to many people vouching for me. I'm sure everyone was surprised when the police suddenly contacted them, but they immediately provided testimonies to help me as soon as they heard my story. Later, I heard Layla was not prosecuted but received a stern warning. After being reprimanded by the police, maybe she felt down, she didn't show up for about 3 months. It was about time to decide on Kevin's inheritance, but since Layla is his biological daughter, she's an heir. That's why I had to contact her. But with no idea of her whereabouts and all my attempts being ignored, I hired a detective to locate her and then had professionals repeatedly reach out to her. I even had a lawyer send certified mail and made various attempts, but Layla kept ignoring everything. Before I knew it, we reached the first anniversary of Kevin's death. At the almost same time, I received an email from Layla. It said she didn't want to be involved anymore. So, I went to family court and filed for an inheritance petitioning. Layla didn't respond even then, leading to no discussion, and ultimately, the family court decided on the inheritance division. But despite ignoring everything, Layla showed up at my house, upset with the outcome. "I'm his real daughter, and getting nothing is absolutely wrong. What's the meaning of this?" It seemed she didn't want to go through the hassle, but still wanted the inheritance. She probably thought she'd automatically get her share as a daughter. But learning she wouldn't get a penny, she was furious. Her audacity to show up only when it suited her interests was astounding, but I decided to calmly tell her the truth. "Do you know when the inheritance period began?" Confidently, Layla answered. "The day the family court's decision came out, right?" Hearing this, I laughed and said, No, you knew of your father's passing the day it happened, so the inheritance period actually began over a year ago. To make it clear to Layla, who didn't seem to get it, I explained further. She claimed it was unfair not to receive her share, but the family court had calmly judged based on Kevin's will and the situation at the time. Firstly, Kevin's will stated he didn't want to give Layla a single penny and wished for me to inherit everything. Normally, this would infringe on Layla's rightful share, which means she could have received half of the inheritance. However, despite my sending registered letters and the involvement of professionals and the court, Layla remained silent. Moreover, Kevin had written in his will, if Layla will abandon the inheritance discussions, I don't want her to have any share, which led to me inheriting everything. The fact that I was taking care of Ashley, Kevin's granddaughter, also played a role. Upon hearing this, Layla retorted, I took care of Dad when he was in the hospital. You just took Ashley from me and stayed home. I contributed to Dad, this isn't right. But I stood my ground. Still lying after all this? You were out having fun, weren't you? When I took care of Ashley, I checked with the hospital, and as expected, you hadn't been there. I was the one who brought Ashley for clothes changes and stuff. Visitors have to write their names when entering the ward, you know? The evidence is all there. The photographs of the hospital's visitor log with dates and times were useful. This was one of the reasons the court ruled in my favor for the full inheritance. Layla, grinding her teeth in frustration, still tried to fight back. Fine. Then I'll sue for infringing on my share. But over a year had passed since the inheritance period began, so that right was time-barred. When I told her this, Layla, unable to comprehend further, exclaimed, that can't be true. No way, that's cheating. Why can't I, his real daughter, get any of his inheritance? She began to panic and fluster. Eventually, she dejectedly tried to leave, so I asked, what about Ashley? I don't have time for that now. I'm barely managing my own life. How can I take care of a child? She said irresponsibly and fled. I couldn't help but find the situation absurd, and a few days later, Layla made her last stand. I want Ashley back, she's my child. It was a sudden change of heart from her previous refusal. Indeed, Layla is Ashley's biological mother, and to me, Ashley is my step-granddaughter. Layla looked triumphant, but I calmly responded. Since that trip, you haven't once taken Ashley or cared for her. Don't you have anything to say about that? Layla replied, just you wanted to take care of her, right? I then asked her, have you been receiving government child support for over a year while I've been taking care of your child? Layla looked puzzled for a moment but then laughed and said, I have the right to receive it as a mother, so it's fine. I smiled at that. Layla, surprised by my sudden change of attitude, asked, what's that supposed to mean? I told her. That means you've been fraudulently receiving government child support without actually taking care of your child. If this gets out, you will be subject to punishment and be required to repay it. Considering you've already caused trouble with the police, I doubt this will just slide. Layla's face turned serious. Actually, I had recorded the entire conversation. It was automatically saved to the cloud, so even if Layla destroyed anything, there would be no problem. It could be considered destruction of property, and either way, Layla was bound to end up with the police. Finally realizing everything, Layla's face looked like she almost cried and said, You didn't report this, did you? She probably meant to the authorities. I confirmed that I had indeed reported it. Layla's face turned even paler, her hands trembling at her mouth. It can't be true. It's true. They said they'd investigate, and I told them I'd provide any evidence I had. This conversation will be submitted as data too. Layla collapsed right there. Seemingly out of strength for any further retort, just mumbling complaints unheard. To Layla, I delivered the final blow. I hired a professional to find you and send a certified letter, so I know about the boyfriend who's been supporting you. After you gave up your apartment, you probably told him some story to move in with him without his knowledge, right? Layla looked up at me. Having a partner to help financially can lead to arrest for fraudulent receipt of child support if the person isn't actually raising the child. Layla, not wanting to raise a child alone, had moved closer when her father contacted her and dumped Ashley on me. She then found a boyfriend and gave up her apartment, intending to take over my house and live with him. But the house was already in my name due to a lifetime gift, so that plan failed, and she likely moved in with her boyfriend under false pretenses. Although it was mostly conjecture, Layla's face confirmed it all as true. Then she made one last attempt. Fine, I get it now, I need Ashley to receive child support, so give her back to me now. Besides, seeing you with Ashley, looking all happy, really annoys me. That's why I came all this way to get her back, she said, giving a childish reason for demanding Ashley's return now. Angered by her view of Ashley as just a tool for money, I responded without losing my composure. Okay, but that's after a proper discussion with Ashley's father, right? Ignoring the dumbfounded Layla, I turned towards the living room and called, Skylar, can you come here for a moment? Hearing a familiar name, Layla got cold feet and tried to flee, but her legs wouldn't move. Just then, the sound of footsteps approached. A man appeared with a cheerful Ashley carried in his arm. His name is Skylar Olson, Layla's ex-husband and Ashley's biological father. I had heard from Layla that Skylar was a club promoter with no sense of responsibility, which led her to leave him, but I doubted whether such a man would pay alimony and regularly provide child support. If he were that responsible, he probably would have changed the job for her and their baby and got married her. With these thoughts, I had a detective look into Layla's past during the inheritance case. It turned out Skylar was just an ordinary office worker with no past as a club promoter. When I boldly reached out to him using Ashley's name, he responded easily. When he met Ashley, Skylar, with tears in his eyes and said, I finally got to meet my daughter. I was so happy when you contacted me. Actually, our divorce was due to Layla's infidelity. She used her status as a mother to take Ashley away, and I've just been paying child support quietly. As he said this, Skylar's gaze towards Ashley, holding her tiny hand, was filled with the love of a father. I thought again that parents who can love and raise Ashley properly should be the ones to take care of her, so I repeatedly consulted child welfare services and the administration about this situation. Legally, Layla still had custody, but it was clear from her actions over the past year that she was not raising Ashley properly. Pushing her child onto a hostile person only when convenient, without any formal adoption, is this really how a mother should act? As I kept making my case, the government workers began to feel sorry for Skylar and Ashley. I hadn't just been working on the inheritance case this past year. I had been thinking about getting Ashley back to where she should belong as soon as possible. I paid extra to the lawyer handling the inheritance to get advice on helping Skylar regain custody, all done quietly behind the scenes. Everything was ready. Skylar, now 26 and being talked about as the next section chief, had no financial issues. There were many people willing to vouch for Skylar's character and his faithful payment of both child support and living expenses for Layla, despite her awful treatment. It was clear who had the advantage in any custody battle. Layla, who neglected Ashley and saw her as a hindrance to her romantic relationships, left her with a stepmother she disliked. Despite enduring Layla's mistreatment, Skylar showed sincere concern and often visited to check on Ashley after learning about the situation. I knew about Layla's problems, including her fraudulent receipt of government child support and her problematic boyfriends. Your current boyfriend is the real club promoter, right? The one you talked to on the phone before. But there's another boyfriend, right? The one who has been supporting your life financially. You've contributed too much to the club promoters and are now drowning in debt. The other guy figured out your double life and left, and the promoter boyfriend is about to ditch you because he can't get more money out of you. Compared to you, Skylar is far more respectable and a loving father. My words were the final blow, and Layla cried loudly, rubbing her forehead on the ground in apology. No one forgave her. She had treated her child as a tool for money and used both me, her stepmother, and Skylar, her ex-husband, for her club visits. Finally, her karma caught up with her. After a while, with the help of my lawyer and others, the court ruled that Skylar would have custody of Ashley. Some of my acquaintances, students' parents, and Kevin's relatives asked if it was really okay. They probably thought it was too easy to give her back to him only because he was her biological father, after all my hardships over the year. Indeed, I did struggle with the decision, but I didn't want to keep Ashley away from a father who loved her. Before talking about Layla's current situation, let me explain what happened. First, Layla was arrested for child support fraud. The fact that she wasn't actually raising her child, the existence of her boyfriend, and another man who was supporting her life played a significant role, leading to her arrest for fraud. She received a probation without actual sentence, but soon after, the custody battle erupted, and she screamed in despair. Unable to run away and with various evidence and testimonies against her, the court ruled it was fair to transfer custody to Skylar. Layla lost everything. Ashley, her boyfriend, her another boyfriend who supported her life, and even her savings, her reputation, and everything. She was working as a temporary worker, but due to poor work performance, she was laid off at the worst time. She ended up losing her job and became so destitute that she was practically living on the streets. With no address, she couldn't get a decent job, and her lack of work history and qualifications led to continuous rejections even for live-in jobs. This was a clear case of reaping what she sowed. As for me, I was living modestly without using Kevin's inheritance. I believe Kevin wanted to share his inheritance with Ashley, his granddaughter. But he feared involving her in any trouble by writing about her in his will, so he didn't. So, I made sure to give Skylar gifts from Kevin's inheritance for Ashley's special occasions. Recently, Skylar, who moved nearby, confessed his feelings to me. "I've grown to love you while visiting Ashley. I didn't say anything because of the difficult times. Ashley sees you as her mother. I know it's disrespectful to you as a widow and to Kevin as my former father-in-law, but please, will you become my family?" Hearing that, I couldn't help but grow feelings for him. Actually, there was more to Kevin's will. It wasn't related to the inheritance, but he concluded with this: "If you find someone you love after my death, please be happy with that person. Your happiness is my happiness." Kevin, usually a man of few words, must have put his feelings into those words as best as he could. I'm thinking about what's best for Kevin, Skylar, and Ashley. I would never have thought at the time that a few years later I would also be present at Ashley's first day at elementary school. A sickly daughter is just a waste and of no use. I don't need such a child. You're a childless couple, so it's perfect for you, right? Be grateful to your sister. My sister came to our house and said that to me. Did the poor niece, who seemed to realize she was being abandoned by her mother, look like she was about to cry? Ever since she was born, my sister, who was allowed to do whatever she wanted, remained mentally a 3-year-old, even after becoming an adult, getting married, and having a child. Eventually, tired of my sister's whims, her husband abandoned her, and she returned to our parents' home. Now she's trying to remarry and is dumping her daughter on me because she's in the way. 11 years later, my sister, who had remarried a company president and was strutting around as the president's wife, came back to me. She looked nothing like a president's wife, shabby and emitting a foul smell. My sister who abandoned her daughter now shamelessly asked for help, but my sister's evil schemes were exposed, leading to even more tragedy for my sister and her husband. I'm a married woman in my late 20s. I have one older sister. My sister was born sickly and grew up believing it was her right to monopolize our parents' love. Our parents, feeling guilty about her frailty, never said no to her whims. It might have been okay until I was born. By the time I was old enough to understand, our house was completely centered around my sister. As I grew up and started asserting myself, our parents always made me give in. Because my sister was sickly and pitiable, it was only natural for me, the healthy one, to endure, they said. I understood that as a child. But I began to question why I always had to endure everything after I started kindergarten and realized that not everything revolved around my family. Expanding my connections beyond my parents and sister, I learned that there were people enduring hardships while living their lives with strength, despite not being sickly like my sister. My sister was beautiful and always indoors, so she was pale. People who didn't know her true nature often said she was like a frail, beautiful girl, and she seemed quite pleased with that. She knew exactly how to gain sympathy and favor from others. At home, she was a selfish princess, but in front of others, she played the role of a caring, considerate sister who endured and persevered. Those unaware of her true nature were easily deceived. Until I went to kindergarten. I never had anything of my own. I never had personal belongings because everything was hand-me-downs from my sister. In nicer terms, they were my sister's cast-offs, but she hated the idea of her things being passed on to me. So she would deliberately damage or dirty them. "You're using my cast-offs? How dare you take things from a sickly person like me? That's why I make them unusable." She would dirty or cut them right in front of me. Naturally, my parents noticed the torn clothes, but my sister would coolly claim that I didn't want her hand-me-downs and tore them up in front of her. My parents said they wouldn't buy new things for a child who didn't take care of them, so I had to wear those tattered clothes. "You should be grateful and wear what your sickly sister gave you with care." When I went out in torn clothes, some neighbors worried if I was being mistreated. When I repeated what my sister told me to say, they would praise me as a good, sister-loving child and sometimes mend the torn parts for me. When I started kindergarten, my parents couldn't keep up the pretense and finally bought me clothes, a bag, and other necessities. My sister had never been to kindergarten due to her frailty, so there were no hand-me-downs. I was thrilled to finally have clothes and a bag of my own. But my sister resented that I went to kindergarten and had things she never got. She often took my bag and lunchbox. But the next day, when I wasn't ready for kindergarten, the already busy mornings became even more hectic and suspicion turned towards her. Then she would coolly claim she saw me put them in a different place, shifting the blame to me. I was scolded harshly by my mother. That's when I realized. Not only should I not defy my sister, but I also couldn't show off or be happy in front of her. I had to stay quiet and suppress my existence in front of her to avoid her wrath. That's when I realized I had no place in this house. When I was in elementary school, they started to find effective medications for my sister's illness. After trying various ones, she recovered to the point of having a healthy body. She began to attend sports activities, which she often missed before, without any difficulty. However, she didn't want to let go of the family life that had always revolved around her. Like the time we went to buy a backpack for me. My sister wanted a new one because she was bored of her current one, saying the old one would be fine for me. My parents thought it was unfair that I was the only one with a hand-me-down when everyone else had brand new backpacks. It was the same with new stationery and clothes. As for clothes, my sister was slim, and I had grown more as per my age, so hand-me-downs were no longer practical. My parents, who had always prioritized my sickly sister, began treating us more equally as she recovered. They used to tell me to endure because my sister was sick, but now they told her to help out as much as she could since she was the older sister. Why do I have to help? What if I do something extra and my illness relapses? The doctor had told us that a relapse was unlikely unless she did excessive exercise. But my sister resisted, throwing things nearby or screaming so loudly it could be heard by neighbors when our parents didn't listen to her. Eventually, her demands were often met. Interestingly, the screams she made were blamed on my tantrums or selfishness. When it became a problem at school and in the neighborhood, everyone believed it was me causing trouble, praising my sister for putting up with a difficult younger sibling. I thought to myself, they don't know anything, yet they make such baseless comments. When my sister graduated from elementary school, I was relieved that we wouldn't be in the same school anymore. In middle school, where she had already graduated, I was glad not to be compared to her. I gradually became more involved in the sports team, while she began hanging out with flashy boys from other schools. I continued the sports I started in middle school through college and got a job at a local company. My sister, although she went to college, didn't look for a job and just hung around, living off our parents' money. She quickly married a guy she reconnected with from college. Initially, her husband tolerated her whims, saying a little selfishness in a woman was charming. But after she had a child and continued her selfish behavior, he couldn't take it anymore and left when their daughter was 4. I felt he was ready to give up everything just to get away from my sister. A year before my sister's divorce, I married a coworker who was actually 4 years older than me. Our marriage happened when her marriage was already falling apart. My niece, like my sister in her childhood, was frail. You'd think my sister, having gone through the same, would be understanding and make her daughter the center of her life. But she was different. Looking at my daughter irritates me. What's the point of living if she can't do anything normal? My sister would say to her daughter. Repeated incidents like these led to their divorce. Oddly, my sister refused to let her ex-husband take care of their daughter. Marrying me meant my husband suddenly learned all the family drama. I was worried he'd be disgusted and consider divorce. After all, who wants to deal with troublesome in-laws? But he reassured me, saying that while marriage does link families, it's ultimately about the individuals involved. He committed to standing by me and overcoming hardships together. And he's proven it time and again. After my sister's divorce, she took her daughter and moved back home. My husband and I had set up our home near my parents' place. He suggested living near my parents so we could help them if needed. When my sister got married, she didn't want to live near our parents' house. Although our parents said not to worry about them, deep down, it was still a concern. And yet, to our surprise, she returned home after her divorce. Her selfishness was as strong as ever. Initially, she helped our parents take care of my niece, but gradually, she started leaving her with them more and more, preferring to go out and have fun. My parents did their best not to burden us, even though we lived nearby. But eventually, we found ourselves taking care of my niece more often. I was wary, knowing she was my sister's child. I even briefed my husband about my sister's long history of unreasonable behavior, preparing him for the worst. However, my niece turned out to be a very good kid, unlike her mother. At first, my niece was reserved and seemed scared around us, but she warmed up after spending some time together. It turned out my niece's fear came from my sister yelling at her. My parents also asked us to be understanding. Slowly, my niece began to help around the house and followed our instructions well. I believe her father, my former brother-in-law, must have raised her well. My niece grew up mostly without her mother's love, shuttling between my parents' house and ours until she was 6. Then, one day, my sister showed up at our house with my niece. I'm getting remarried to a company president. He doesn't want a sickly child because they're just money pits and bad luck. Take this child for my happiness. I realized my sister's selfishness was kicking in again. When I asked if our parents knew about this, she retorted that it was none of my business. And she insisted I should just do as told. Don't tell her father either. Officially, she's staying with me, and you childless folks are kindly helping out. Let's stick to that story. I was dumbfounded. My niece, who may not have understood everything, clearly knew she was being abandoned by her mother. How pitiful it was that even such a horrible mother meant something to her. If you're going to push her off on us, then we won't just be part-time caretakers for our niece. We will legally adopt her and raise her as our own child. I declared, without consulting my husband, that if my sister was pushing her off on us, we wouldn't just be part-time caretakers. My husband, who happened to overhear, was also furious at my sister's attitude and agreed with my decision. He added that ultimately, it was up to my niece. No way. If her father finds out, I won't get child support. Remember, don't tell him about the remarriage. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My sister nonchalantly revealed that she refused to let her ex-husband have custody because she was receiving child support, which she wasn't using for my niece but for her own leisure. Apparently, even our parents didn't know this. She threatened me not to tell anyone, hoping to continue receiving child support while dumping the actual care on us. I was astounded by her audacity and nonsense. I knew we had to get her to agree to the adoption, or my niece would continue to be a pawn in her games. I was determined not to let my niece suffer like I did. My husband suggested, as long as nobody tells, he won't find out. After threatening us one more time about meddling, my sister left my niece with us and departed. We then asked my niece what she wanted. Despite being only 6, she had her own will. We wanted to respect her feelings as much as possible. And so did my parents. With tears in her eyes, she decided to become our child. Those tears seemed more like tears of joy than resignation. To avoid any trouble when my sister returned, we quickly finalized the adoption process with my niece. After that, I tried to contact my sister to inform her, but she had remarried and became unreachable. Now that I'm the president's wife, I don't want you coming to me for money. Goodbye, poor people. Don't contact me ever again. My sister's phone number and email were no longer in use. When I told our parents about this last conversation with her, they were furious to a degree I had never seen before, despite always favoring her in the past. They declared they would cut ties with her and never welcome her back home. However, they didn't need to worry. My sister never contacted them either. Little did we know, cutting off contact with us would lead to an unbelievable turn of events, but that would happen a bit later. We raised my niece with love and sometimes strictness, as if she were our own daughter. She grew up to be a sincere, kind, and well-rounded child. During this time, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy. My niece treated him as her real brother and actively participated in his care. Her frail health, a concern since her childhood, improved under the care of my sister's former doctor. By middle school, she had developed physically like her peers and became stronger. The doctor mentioned that environmental factors can contribute to frail health. My sister relegated my sickly niece to the position of a burdensome child and neglected to improve her condition. It might have been why it took so long for my niece to get stronger. As she grew healthier, my niece became more proactive in absorbing various experiences. We encouraged her interests, without forcing anything on her. We wanted her to learn that it's sometimes necessary to give up, as not every experience is a waste of time. This perspective might come from my own youth spent in sports, where injuries are common and you have to decide whether to continue or take a different path. I struggled with various concerns, but in the end, it's up to me to make the decision. Ultimately, it's up to the individual to decide and take responsibility for their choices. I asked my niece if she was ready to take responsibility for quitting something midway and if she would have no regrets or blame others for her decisions. She assured us that any decision she made was her own responsibility, so we didn't say anything more. My niece tried various sports but didn't excel beyond the average level. Though my husband and I are sports enthusiasts, we never pushed our interests on her. She was creative and quick-witted, excelling in her studies and always among the top students. She went to a private high school known for its unique educational approach that focused not only on academics but also on nurturing each student's individuality. At this school, my niece and a friend became passionate about developing a new product. Initially, they provided their prototype, a groundbreaking new product born from their combined experiences, to hospitals and nursing homes. My niece, though healthier, still had difficulty hearing in one ear and occasionally used a hearing aid. She had been teased in elementary school for it, and her friend's grandmother refused to wear a hearing aid, calling it unattractive, which led to communication difficulties and family conflicts. That's when they came up with the idea. What if hearing aids were cute or stylish accessories? They began by attaching their designs to existing hearing aids, which unexpectedly gained popularity. A hearing aid company proposed a collaboration, and they decided to start a business as high school entrepreneurs, becoming a local sensation. Their product was featured in the regional newspaper and later introduced on local television. Word of mouth about my niece's business spread, and profits soared. There were even requests for stylish canes, not just hearing aids. My niece managed to balance business and studies, reaching her senior year of high school without neglecting either. It was a fulfilling 3 years for both her and us, her adoptive parents. It had been 11 years since she became our daughter. We hadn't heard from my sister in all this time, so we thought we'd never see her again. Then, out of the blue, my sister contacted us when only my niece was home. My niece answered the phone, not knowing it was her biological mother. Our home phone has settings to block nuisance calls. Since there was no alert, my niece inadvertently answered it. My niece wouldn't say exactly what my sister said, but she expressed a desire to meet my sister. My husband and I were torn. Could it be that despite everything, she still yearned for her biological mother? We debated whether it was right for us to have a say in this, worrying if it was arrogant of us. Eventually, we decided to respect my niece's wishes but requested to be present if she met her mother. We waited at the designated place and time. And a drastically changed sister appeared. Her hair was dull with streaks of gray. Her face gaunt and covered in blemishes. And her clothes were ill-fitting and worn. Behind her were her husband and a small child. Look at my luck. Who would have thought my daughter would turn out to be a moneymaker? She said with a hoarse, dry laugh. Apparently, her husband's business had failed, they lost everything, and now lived in a shabby apartment. They were struggling, waiting for discounted meals at supermarkets when my sister saw my niece on a street TV, now famous as a high school CEO. She had looked up everything about my niece, including her new product developments. It seemed she planned to leech off my niece's company, even contemplating taking it over. Look, this is your brother. You'll be the breadwinner now. Work hard for our sake and let us live comfortably, she said, grabbing my niece's arm as if to take her away. How dare she say such things? She's not your daughter anymore. I thought to myself. I was about to warn her that I'd report it as an abduction if she tried to take her away in front of us, but my niece shouted first. Who are you? I don't know you. Don't call yourself my mother, it's annoying. My parents are these two right here. My real brother is waiting for us at our grandparents' house. My sister became hysterical, screaming about the debt of raising her. Her habit of shrieking when things didn't go her way, even as an adult, was evident. Is it okay to make such a scene here? If you don't back down, I can let your ex-husband hear this, I threatened, pulling out an old voice recorder. It played the conversation from 11 years ago when she abandoned my niece, including her threats about child support. My sister lunged at me for the recorder, but my husband stepped in to protect us. Did you know that you're still entitled to child support payments even if you remarry? She seemed unaware that remarrying doesn't stop child support payments. But you forfeit your rights when you give up custody, don't you? They won't find out if I don't tell them? The world doesn't work that conveniently. Actually, when we were finalizing the adoption, we met with my niece's biological father, who had asked us to redirect the child support payments to us. But we refused the child support. We wanted my niece to meet her biological father if she ever wished to, and vice versa. I believed it was her biological father who had taught her manners and decency. He was too kind and selfless, always putting my niece's happiness before his own. We conveyed to him that my niece would be saddened if he weren't happy, and he understood. Later, he remarried and had children. My sister, his ex-wife, seemed oblivious to the fact that child support payments had ceased. At the time of her remarriage, she was living a life of luxury without financial worries. However, after the bankruptcy, she must have realized the missing child support payments. Damn it! It was your doing, wasn't it? She accused. She had noticed the absence of payments but refrained from contacting us, not wanting to reveal her fallen state. It was puzzling why she would leech off my niece while still maintaining some pride. Perhaps she thought her daughter would sympathize and help her out. But the misuse of child support money didn't seem to be something that could be easily addressed, as my sister was not in a state to make rational decisions. she left hastily with her young son, possibly fearing legal action from her ex-husband. Yet, my sister persisted in stalking my niece. We frequently received messages from the high school about a suspicious old woman lurking around. My sister, who, despite being in her 30s, appeared much older due to her unkempt appearance. Eventually, she was perceived as a threat by other parents and the school's security, and even reported by students. My husband ultimately confronted her, causing a commotion that attracted our neighbors. The community united to chase her away. Since then, she has avoided our neighborhood, deterred by locals brandishing brooms and bats. My sister and her husband, with their young child in tow, sought financial help from our parents, revealing that they had been parasitically living off the supposed non-existent child support. This deception, along with her lifestyle funded by child support, led to our parents cutting ties with her and kicking her out. Our mother, meticulous with finances, had kept detailed records of all the assistance provided to my sister and demanded repayment. Apparently, my mother, having been deceived, furiously demanded the return of everything she had been swindled out of. My sister and her husband, told never to show their faces again or else they'd be forced to repay the swindled money by any means necessary, never contacted us again, as they had no money to repay. My sister, still selfish, eventually abandoned her child at a facility, leaving without any words of return. She hopped from job to job, causing problems and getting fired. She stayed married, thinking she couldn't survive otherwise, while her husband, held back by his pride, struggled to find employment. They believed it was better to keep the slightly earning sister than separate. However, expecting her to be a provider was futile. Now, I hear they live on the streets, scavenging for leftovers. Meanwhile, our family, firmly grounded, enjoys fulfilling days. My niece is soon to take her college entrance exams, aspiring to study business management abroad and expand her current business. I wholeheartedly support her in these endeavors.
Mom, I can't take it anymore. It's impossible with only $100 a month for allowance.
Emily, my daughter who had moved to New York for college, had come home several times a year, but I had never heard such a complaint from her.
What? I've been transferring $2,200 every month.
At first, I couldn't understand what Emily was talking about. I raised my voice in surprise, but Emily shouted back, equally surprised.
What? $2,200?
Could the transfer have gone to the wrong account? No, that couldn't be. If the transfer had been wrong, I would have heard from my sister-in-law and her husband. The monthly allowance was actually being transferred to their account. Considering Emily's busy college life and the possibility of her forgetting to pay rent, I had been transferring the combined amount for her living expenses and rent to my sister-in-law's account. They were supposed to hand over $1,600 to Emily after deducting rent. Emily, crying on the phone, wouldn't lie about such things.
No way!
A thought crossed my mind. One I didn't want to consider, but it seemed the only explanation. After ending the call with Emily, I hurried to a certain place. My name is Julia, 47 years old. Currently, I work part-time at a local supermarket. Since marrying my husband, Jeff, we had 2 children. Our son, Chris, is 23 this year. Emily, our daughter, is 20 and currently studying at a university in New York. Emily has always been a bit scatterbrained and lively, so I never imagined she would get into one of the top universities in New York. Unlike Emily, Chris was always serious and good at his studies from childhood, but he's almost in a state of seclusion now. The trigger for his seclusion was failing his college entrance exams. Chris, being introverted, had few friends and took pride in being more academically inclined than his socially active sister, Emily. He always told himself, studying is more important than playing for the future. He might have also harbored a feeling of not wanting to lose to Emily, who was enjoying her youth. Despite maintaining top grades in high school, Chris failed his college entrance exams. Everyone thought his admission was a sure thing, so the shock was tremendous for him. He couldn't understand why he failed. On the day of the results, expecting his success, we prepared a lavish meal and waited for his return. But the moment he came back, I knew something terrible had happened. He had a look of despair I had never seen before. Since then, Chris barely left his room. He's not aggressive towards us and communicates when necessary. But he shows no intention of working. Whenever we bring up employment, he shuts down. Emily, witnessing Chris's failure, seemed to have put in her own effort in her way. She studied diligently in secret, balancing it well with her leisure time. She had a clear dream of becoming a teacher and aimed for a prestigious university for that purpose. She succeeded. Much to the astonishment of Chris, who couldn't believe it. Though not on bad terms, Emily's university acceptance seemed to have accelerated Chris's withdrawal. With Emily living in a dorm in New York and Chris in seclusion. Our family's finances were stretched thin, even with my husband working. Having been a stay-at-home mom for many years, I decided to start working at a local supermarket due to these circumstances. Having never worked outside since getting married, everything felt new and challenging. But I had no choice but to work hard for my kids. Emily, who moved to New York for college, was living in an apartment managed by my husband's sister, Michelle, and her husband. Michelle's husband earns a living through real estate management, inherited from his parents. I'm truly grateful for their support, especially since college tuition alone is quite expensive. I hadn't seen Michelle and her husband since our wedding, so honestly, I didn't know them very well. Now that they were renting a room to Emily at a discounted rate, I started communicating with them over the phone. My only impression of them was from a brief conversation at the wedding, and I felt uneasy about their offer. Back then, it was clear they didn't think highly of me. There was a family gathering just before the wedding, and throughout, they seemed displeased. Even when I greeted them, their responses were curt, to the point where I thought, I'd rather not deal with these people. We hadn't interacted for a long time, but with Emily's college enrollment, Jeff reached out to them. "Have you been keeping in touch with your sister regularly?" I asked Jeff, feeling anxious, but his response was vague. "Yeah, we chat occasionally, and I trust my sister completely." It was obvious they weren't in close contact, but Jeff seemed to have a lot of trust in his sister. Not wanting to sound bitter, I agreed to accept their offer. Emily, too, seemed apprehensive about relying on an aunt she hadn't met, but she couldn't complain. She readily agreed to our suggestion. Once Emily started living in Michelle's apartment, Jeff started receiving frequent calls from his sister. I thought she was just concerned about Emily. But listening to their conversations, it didn't seem that way. "She's just nervous because she hasn't seen you guys in years. Can you cut her some slack?" It appeared Michelle and her husband were displeased with Emily's behavior. But what did they expect from Emily, their niece? Since Emily herself didn't complain, I assumed they were only venting to Jeff, but my anxiety grew day by day. Can I really trust these people with Emily? I subtly asked Jeff if Emily was getting along with them, but he always evaded the question. Emily wouldn't tell me the truth out of consideration, so all I could do was trust Michelle and her husband. But that trust was soon betrayed. One day, when Jeff and I were shopping at a department store, I was buying groceries while Jeff wanted to check out a different floor. Seeing no reason to object, I let him go. I finished shopping earlier than usual and went to look for Jeff on the second floor. Just as I was about to call him, I saw him in a high-end brand store. "What's he doing?" I wondered, feeling uneasy. I approached him and asked, "What are you doing here?" Startled by my sudden appearance, Jeff looked visibly flustered.
"Well, it's just that."
He seemed to have bought something, and a salesperson was packing the item. "Could you please confirm the shipping address?" Upon questioning Jeff, I learned that the purchase was for Michelle. "She's taking care of Emily, and she insisted on a gift," he explained. Appalled, I immediately suggested moving Emily to another place. But Jeff refused, saying it would be disrespectful to Michelle and her husband. Fortunately, Emily seemed unharmed, and Jeff pleaded, "Let's just see how things go a little longer." Overwhelmed by his earnestness, I agreed to maintain the status quo. About a year after Emily started college, a phone call from her revealed a shocking truth.
Mom, I can't take it anymore. Surviving on just $100 a month allowance is impossible.
I had heard nothing like this from Emily, who had come home several times a year.
What? I'm transferring $2,200 every month.
Initially, I couldn't understand what Emily was talking about. I blurted out in shock, but Emily, not to be outdone, yelled back.
What? $2,200?
Could the transfer have gone to the wrong account? No, that couldn't be. If it had, my sister-in-law and her husband would have contacted us. I was transferring the monthly allowance to their account because, with Emily's busy life at college in New York, forgetting to pay rent would be disastrous. So, I had been sending the combined amount for her living expenses and rent to them. They were supposed to give Emily $1,600 after deducting the rent. Emily, crying on the phone, couldn't be lying. She must have been living on the edge. I hurriedly transferred a few $1,000s to Emily's account, even before verifying the facts with my sister-in-law. But there was someone else I needed to talk to before that. My son, Chris. He's the one who's been making the monthly transfers to Emily. Although Chris has been mostly confined to his room, I had asked him to do the transfers, so he would occasionally step outside. I trusted him with this important task, hoping it would be meaningful for him. I couldn't imagine Chris stealing the allowance. But he might know something. With a heavy heart, I knocked on Chris's door.
Chris, I just got a call from Emily. She says she's only receiving $100 a month.
A heavy sigh came from inside the room.
You think I stole it?
Chris's direct response caught me off guard. Sensing the slight doubt I had harbored, I hastily denied it, but Chris didn't respond further. That night, when Jeff came home, I immediately shared this puzzling situation.
That's it. I need to have a serious talk with Chris.
Jeff seemed convinced Chris had stolen the money. Probably thinking it made sense given Chris's reclusive state and lack of income. Packages, likely bought online, were frequently delivered to Chris. Jeff suspected these were bought with the money meant for Emily.
It's not decided yet, is it? Can you please contact your sister to see if she knows anything?
I asked, wanting to believe in Chris. Jeff seemed to think I was suspecting his sister and responded irritably.
You think my sister stole it? If you're so sure, why don't you call her yourself?
Feeling it was pointless to continue discussing with Jeff, I decided to contact my sister-in-law. When I told her about Emily's call, she reacted so dramatically that it almost seemed exaggerated.
What? You're transferring $2,200? I'm only getting $700 a month.
She should have been receiving $600 for rent, so her reaction made me question why she hadn't found it strange that Emily was only receiving $100.
Jeff said your son is the one making the transfers, right?
From her tone, it was clear she suspected Chris had taken the money.
Indeed, I ask my son to make the transfers every month, but there's no way he would do anything to trouble his sister.
I was angered by her insinuations and blurted out defensively.
So what are you saying? Are you accusing us of stealing the money you sent?
She was furious one moment and then abruptly hung up the phone the next. I just wanted to know if she had any idea about the situation, but her accusatory tone towards Chris felt off to me. A few days after Emily's call.
Are you a relative of Emily?
I received a call from a hospital in New York on my cell phone. It turned out that Emily had collapsed from overwork and was rushed to the hospital. Though they assured me her life wasn't in danger, I hurried to her side after getting the call. Led by a nurse, I entered Emily's hospital room and saw her lying there, much more gaunt than before.
Mom, I'm sorry for worrying you.
She whispered weakly, forcing a smile for me. After the call, I had transferred some money to her, but it seems her previous overexertion had caught up with her. She told me she had been working night shifts after college classes every day. With just $100 from my sister-in-law, she couldn't even cover her utility bills, let alone food and transportation expenses. Why didn't you say anything when you came home? I asked through tears. But Emily simply said she didn't want to worry me. Had my sister-in-law Michelle not noticed Emily's condition over the past year? Shouldn't she have shown some concern? Although I had been grateful to Michelle and her husband for providing a cheap room, my gratitude had now turned to anger. I explained to Emily that I'd be staying in New York for a bit and then headed straight to Michelle's house. When I rang the doorbell and announced myself, Michelle seemed surprised to see me.
Well, yeah, collapsing from just $100 a month isn't surprising,
she said with a laugh when I told her about Emily's condition.
Aren't you concerned? Didn't you notice anything odd about Emily?
I demanded, unable to contain my anger.
Who do you think you are? Blaming us? Do you realize who's been allowing your daughter to live?
With a ferocity as if she was about to lunge at me, my sister-in-law yelled. I had felt something was off during our phone conversation, and now it was clear. It seemed like she had something to hide and was getting defensive when accused, which couldn't be helped.
First of all, your good-for-nothing son. It's obvious he's been stealing the money. And you're blaming us? Do you have any proof?
Michelle insulted Chris and ended our conversation abruptly, slamming the door in my face. I stayed in New York for a while to watch over Emily. During this time, I told her about the allowance and that Chris was responsible for transferring it.
Aunt Michelle says my brother stole it? No way, Chris would never do that.
Listening to her, I realized Emily had been suspicious of Michelle and her husband's actions since starting college. She thought it unlikely that I would only provide a $100 allowance, but was too afraid to bring it up, fearing a mistake. My heart ached for her consideration. A few days later, after all the tests confirmed there was no serious issue, Emily's color improved and she was discharged.
I'm sorry for all the worry, but I'm fine now.
Despite her lingering distrust towards Michelle and her husband, Emily was also worried about Chris. Indeed, I was concerned whether Jeff had said anything to Chris, accusing him of theft. I handed Emily enough money and decided to return home for the time being. Upon returning home and checking with my husband, it seemed there was no contact from my sister-in-law. He also hadn't spoken much with Chris, which was a relief as it meant the worst-case scenario was avoided.
I went to see Emily and also stopped by Michelle's.
I told Jeff about Emily's worn-out state and her overworking for living expenses. I subtly criticized Michelle and her husband for their lack of concern.
Michelle's busy, probably only sees Emily when handing over the money each month,
Jeff said, more concerned about his sister than his own daughter's health.
Aren't you worried about your daughter collapsing? Is Michelle that important to you? She's calling Chris a thief.
Jeff frowned at my words. It's obvious Chris did it, isn't it?
What about all the packages he receives? How else would he afford them?
He said excitedly, then realized he had gone too far. He seemed to regret speaking so harshly.
Anyway, please stop speaking ill of my sister. Maybe ask Chris a bit more if he knows anything.
Saying this, my husband left the room, looking embarrassed. After a while, I heard the door on the second floor open. It was Chris coming out of his room. He must have overheard our earlier argument because we had raised our voices. Coming down the stairs, Chris let out a big sigh and looked me in the eyes.
I swear, I didn't steal any money. There's no way I would steal Emily's important money.
His face was earnest. And it was unusual for him to leave his room and come to me like this. He must really want to clear his suspicion.
Mom, I'll go to Aunt Michelle's and ask her directly.
I nodded emphatically at Chris's words. The next day, Chris and I headed straight to Michelle's house. It had been years since I last went out with Chris. Despite the situation, I couldn't help but think about that. Throughout the train ride, Chris was silent, but from his demeanor, I was convinced Michelle and her husband were stealing the money. Chris's eyes said it all. And he was worried about Emily. He couldn't forgive Michelle and her husband for putting his dear sister through this. He said he was going to ask, but I knew he wanted to confront them about their actions. He couldn't stand the thought of being wronged more than their disregard for Emily. When we arrived at the station, we immediately went to Michelle's house. I assumed if we called ahead, they would find a reason to turn us away. Sure enough, Michelle was clearly flustered by our unexpected visit. She seemed incredulous that Chris, whom she'd heard was reclusive, was here.
Aunt Michelle, sorry to bother you suddenly. About Emily's allowance, I've been transferring $2,200 every month without fail. This is the correct account number, right?
Chris didn't give Michelle a chance to interject, showing her the account number noted on his smartphone.
This is important. Can you check it right now?
Michelle looked evasive, but urged by Chris, she went to get her bank book. When she returned with it, Chris didn't waste a moment.
Is this right? Can you confirm the number for me?
After Chris recited the account number, Michelle responded.
It seems correct.
Hearing this, Chris nodded and continued.
I thought so. Could you please open that book and show us? If the amount written is $700, then I must have made some mistake.
Chris was straightforward, looking Michelle in the eyes. Indeed, if Michelle was right about Chris stealing the money, it would all be proven by that book.
Mom said that when she visited last time, you were sure I was stealing the money, right? If you show us now, she'll be convinced, won't she? Whether her son is lying or not.
It was like a scene from a detective show, with Chris trying to prove his innocence. Michelle, on the other hand, was just standing there, overwhelmed by the situation.
Why do I have to show you what's in my bank book? Are you saying I stole it?
Michelle was clearly agitated and snapped at Chris. But Chris didn't rise to her provocation, staying calm.
I'm not saying you stole anything, Aunt Michelle. Maybe there was some trouble with the system. Anyway, can you please show us where the depositor's name says Chris?
I joined in, urging her, please, we just want to clear this up. Michelle's face turned red as she screamed.
Enough already! Don't act all high and mighty when you're the one stealing the money.
She was like a child throwing a tantrum, trying to chase us out. Then, as my sister-in-law shouted, "Get out!" Chris, defying her, squeezed out a forceful response.
I'll prove you stole it, no doubt about it.
Chris's intense voice silenced my sister-in-law for a moment. Seeing this, Chris said, "That's enough for today," and turned his back to her. I followed Chris without a word, unable to speak.
Chris! Wait, Chris!
When I looked at his face, it was distorted with frustration. He was upset about not being able to prove his innocence.
I shouldn't have spoken to you like I doubted you. But listen, I don't think you stole anything anymore.
I said this firmly, apologizing wholeheartedly to Chris. In response, as if answering my words, he muttered, "I know." I suggested visiting Emily, who was recovering. But Chris, still unable to prove his innocence, probably felt he couldn't face her. "Can I go home first?" he asked, then headed towards the station alone. After visiting Emily, I returned home later than Chris. He had returned before me and was holed up in his room, as usual, trying not to be noticed by my husband. Jeff too seemed embarrassed since then, avoiding both me and Chris. Pretending to bring food, I entered Chris's room.
I'm sorry, I couldn't do more. Emily's feeling better now, so don't worry.
Hearing about Emily's recovery, Chris seemed relieved and opened up.
I'm sorry for always causing worry. I've been doing some work online bit by bit, but I couldn't bring myself to say it.
His confession surprised me, and I let out an involuntary sound. Listening to Chris's story, I slowly understood what he meant.
Years of being a recluse would naturally make people suspect me of stealing,
he said with a self-deprecating laugh. To prove where the money for his packages came from, Chris revealed his secret. After failing his exams, he had initially escaped reality, doing nothing. But then, realizing he couldn't continue like that, he started self-studying programming and design. Chris, a quick learner and studious by nature, had grown to the point where he could earn money with these skills over the past few years.
I'm still an amateur, so I was going to tell you when I could make a living out of it.
Tears naturally flowed as I listened to my son's unexpected confession. Seeing me cry, Chris laughed, saying, "Don't cry, it's all right," but I knew he must have felt guilty inside. Shaking off his own insecurities, Chris spoke up again. "There's something else I want to talk to you about, Mom." And so he began to speak with conviction. "That's why I came here." The next day, in our living room, sat my sister-in-law, Christy. The content of Chris's conversation from yesterday was about another aunt of his, Christy. After his exam failure, Christy, who had always been close to Chris, showed more concern for him than even we did. His interest in programming started under her influence. Hearing about Emily's allowance issue, Chris first consulted with Christy. She had always known about the bad blood between Christy and my sister-in-law Michelle. Unlike my husband Jeff, who had absolute trust in Michelle, Christy didn't trust her. She was close enough to visit our house occasionally but hated Michelle. Indeed, Christy had always been very helpful to me, more straightforward than Michelle. Christy suggested framing Michelle to make her confess. He seemed lively and happy around Christy, a rare sight for me. Grateful to Christy for making Chris this happy, I felt I couldn't thank her enough. That jerk, making my dear nephew and niece suffer like this. I'll expose her soon, Christy said, eager to teach Michelle a lesson, as she and Chris enthusiastically planned together. Without Christy, I shudder to think what might have become of Chris. Watching them, I felt conflicted as a parent, but I had no choice but to rely on Christy's plan. We readied ourselves and decided to confront Michelle again the next day. I was determined to make her regret insulting my dear son. Containing my eagerness, we prepared for the next day. The following day. "Did Jeff suspect anything?" Christy asked while munching on her lunch in the train heading to Michelle's house. Fortunately, Jeff seemed his usual self, unaware of our plan. I was worried he might side with his sister if he found out about our plan at this stage. He cares about Chris and Emily, but for some reason, he can't stand up to his sister. According to Christy, their relationship has always been like that. It's not so much about trust or admiration, it's more like he can't defy her, she said with a sense of resignation. Compared to my serious and dull husband, Christy was bright and carefree. She grew up seeing her sister-in-law bossing around her brother and was determined not to end up like that. Christy is still single and makes a living as a freelancer. Though Chris had failed his exams, seeing Christy living independently and on her terms must have inspired him not to give up. We enjoyed our time together, but soon we would be arriving in New York. Christy's plan seemed surprisingly simple, almost childlike, but she was confident. "This is where I excel," she said, pointing to her head and smiling at me and Chris. "Big sis, what's going on here?" Arriving at Michelle's house, Christy confronted her in a seemingly distressed manner. Michelle seemed utterly unprepared for Christy's visit. "I deposited the money for Chris once. And now I'm being accused of stealing it?" Following Christy's instructions, Chris and I stayed hidden near Michelle's house, watching the two of them. "What? Why would you make the deposit for Chris?" Michelle asked, her anger evident. "Because I live nearby. Unlike Chris, I keep proper transaction records." At her words, Michelle's face turned pale. "What do you mean by that? Are you also saying I stole it?" Christy wouldn't let her get away with playing dumb. "So where did the $1,600 go?" "Never mind, I'll take the transaction records and go to Jeff." As Christy turned to leave, Michelle immediately shouted, Wait. Just wait a minute. I understand. Christy's plan worked perfectly, and Michelle took the bait. "Say I was told by Chris to let him take some of the money for himself. It's obvious Jeff will believe me over a reclusive son." At that moment, Christy grinned mischievously. "Big sis, are you admitting that you stole Emily's money?" Michelle, thinking Christy was shaking her down, clicked her tongue and responded. "As usual with you. It's obvious, isn't it?" It was indeed as we suspected. Watching this exchange, Chris burst out.
So, you were the one who stole it.
Michelle was taken aback at the sudden appearance of Chris.
What are you doing here?
Confused, she looked at Christy standing nearby, who couldn't help but burst into laughter.
Big sis, you're so naive. You've always underestimated us, and that's why you were tricked so easily.
Christy then turned serious and pulled out her phone.
Just so you know, I recorded our conversation.
Michelle glared at Christy resentfully, then turned to plead with me and Chris.
I'm so sorry. I never meant to trouble Emily. It was just a moment of weakness, Chris, I'm sorry for saying such terrible things to you.
Michelle suddenly burst into a tirade and then, right there, she knelt down and apologized to us.
Stop it, sis. It's embarrassing. I'll report this to Jeff, so just wait. Running away is useless, you know?
Stunned by Christy's words, my sister-in-law began to sob right there. Urged by Christy's "let's go," Chris and I decided to leave the scene. Afterward, the three of us headed to Emily's apartment. The whole truth of the incident was revealed by Christy, proving Chris's innocence.
But Emily never doubted Chris at all.
I explained, but it seemed the two siblings understood each other's feelings well enough. Anyway, it was decided that we would move out of the apartment immediately. Due to the hardships of the past year, there was hardly any luggage in the room. It took less than an hour to pack up everything.
Let's go home for now.
After a light meal, the four of us returned to the house where Jeff was waiting.
I see.
Hearing our explanation and bringing Emily back home, Jeff let out a deep sigh. We played him the recording Christy made of her conversation with Michelle and explained everything. Shocked to learn of his sister's crime, Jeff seemed deeply affected. However, accepting the truth, he spoke heavily.
Chris, I'm truly sorry for doubting you.
Jeff sincerely apologized. Chris accepted the apology with a nod.
Christy, send me that audio file. I'm going to the police now.
Jeff, resolute, decided to report the theft by Michelle and her husband to the police. It must have taken immense courage for him to make this decision. But now, maybe we were finally freed from his sister's control. A few days later, the police, informed by Jeff, arrested Michelle and her husband. The evidence of theft was clear in their bank account, and they quickly confessed. For a real estate company that relies on trust, this arrest was devastating. According to Jeff, who visited the police station as a relative of the accused, Michelle's mental state was deteriorating day by day. Betrayed by her brother and sister, she was in shock. Moreover, she seemed to understand that her real hell would begin after serving her sentence. The survival of their company was doubtful, and their luxurious lifestyle was now impossible. It was self-inflicted, but I couldn't help feeling a little sorry for Jeff. The money meant for Emily was returned from another account of Michelle and her husband. With that money, Emily rented a new apartment. This time without relying on them. Chris, along with Christy, started a small design company. This might be a good opportunity, Christy had decided. Seeing Chris like this seemed to lighten Jeff's load. Although he still felt guilty for doubting his son, they began to talk more than before. As a result, I felt closer to Jeff than I had in the past. Although Emily and Chris suffered because of Michelle, this incident brought our family closer together. It was truly a case of after the rain, the ground hardens. With Chris working, our family finances improved, but I decided to continue working too. Watching everyone, I couldn't help but feel the same. From now on, we would move forward together, including Christy, as a family of 5. My name is Sarah Johnson, I'm 42 years old. Originally, I was working for a corporation, but I quit when I got married and have since been handling the accounting for my husband's company. We're a family of 4, with my husband and our 2 kids. Today, we're finally having a family outing. We traveled a bit away from New York to an outlet at the base of Mount Rainier. My husband's company has been busy, and as the accountant, I've been swamped too. Since I rarely get to shop at my leisure, my husband, thinking of me, took the kids for a stroll, letting me enjoy some much-needed shopping time. As I was wondering where to go next, I accidentally caught sight of someone I never wanted to see again. I quickly averted my gaze, hoping not to be noticed, and subtly quickened my pace. But my wish was in vain, as I soon heard a voice I never wanted to hear again.
"Is that Sarah?"
I didn't want to hear his voice or see him ever again. There he was, my ex-husband, who had callously left me for another woman 12 years ago. The warm space in my heart felt a tiny black ink spot dropping in, just like back then. I wanted to erase it immediately. I didn't even look up and tried to pass by with just a nod. But my ex-husband was not the kind to let that happen. His personality hadn't changed at all since then.
"What, ignoring me? Shopping alone? Wait, did you come all the way here from New York by yourself? That's sad."
His devilish nature was still intact, over 40 and still mocking me with sarcastic laughter.
"It's none of your business, really."
I should have just ignored him and walked away, but maybe I haven't changed either, unable to do that. More than that, I knew that ignoring him would only make him louder and more bothersome, so I just wanted to keep things as calm as possible. That was all I was thinking.
"Oh, sorry. We're just a happy family here, hard for you to look at, huh? Oh, this kid? He's the one from that time, 12 years already. Meanwhile, you're still the same? Well, I guess no one would want an infertile old woman. 42 and single, I pity you."
He always talked too much, saying whatever he wanted, regardless of anyone else's feelings. He was probably trying to show off his child to the me in his mind. Standing there was a well-groomed boy with an air similar to that notorious woman. It was a relief, or maybe not, that he didn't resemble the man in front of me at all. I couldn't help but wonder what goes on in the mind of this man who could talk so insensitively about such things in front of his own child.
"Thanks, but you really don't need to worry about me, Mr. Shore."
I had so much I wanted to say. Back then, I couldn't ask this man anything. But even if I had, I knew it wouldn't have changed anything, and now, it's meaningless and unwanted. So, I conceded as much as I could with that response. But this man didn't understand anything.
"Huh? Worry about you? No way, that was sarcasm. You don't get it?"
He laughed crudely with that woman, mocking me. The boy looked at them, his face a picture of confusion. For some reason, I felt pity for him and couldn't take my eyes off the child. Then, my ex-husband, hiding the boy behind him, yelled out,
"What are you looking at? You'll rot just by looking at us."
He threw a childish tantrum at me. Thanks to him, we attracted a bit of attention. I didn't want to look at them, I just wanted to leave. I had just nodded and tried to pass by, but they kept provoking me. But responding in kind would only add fuel to the fire. Even returning small words like earlier was just throwing fuel to this guy. Fully aware of this, I restrained myself to a vague, small smile. However, even that seemed to displease them as they began to hurl more insults. No matter what, it seemed that just being me was enough to upset them. As I seriously wondered what to do, I heard a familiar, sweet voice.
"Mom, do you know them?"
Turning to the voice, I saw my son, Tyler, looking at me curiously. He had returned without me noticing, brought back by my husband from their stroll. My daughter, Emily, was also there. A few steps behind, my husband was smiling gently. "Ah, sorry, you're back? Were you having fun?"
"Uh-huh. We were gonna go check out the play park, and we saw you here." "Oh, really?" "Yeah, these people are old acquaintances of mine." "Hey, Tyler, Emily, say hello."
I called Tyler and Emily to my side and prompted them to greet my ex-husband's family. They both greeted.
"Nice to meet you, I'm Tyler Johnson." "Hello, I'm Emily Johnson."
The two of them were taken aback, clearly not expecting to be greeted by strangers. They were at a loss for words, struck by the surprise. I couldn't help but smile inwardly at their reaction, hoping for their forgiveness.
"Hey, since it's been a while, can we talk a bit more? Is that okay?" Sure, that's fine. We're gonna play over there, so take your time talking.
Tyler's kind words made me smile naturally. Then, I noticed that child, staring at us enviously.
Tyler. Yeah? What's up?
This boy is about your age. Why don't you play with him? I said, introducing my ex-husband's son to Tyler. Tyler and Emily love making new friends, so I was sure they'd get along well.
Darling, could you please take care of them for a little longer?
I called out to my husband, who was standing behind the children. His gaze shifted to my ex-husband. My ex-husband, silent under that gaze, shrugged his shoulders slightly. My husband, who's a younger childhood friend, has always supported me after I was hurt by my ex-husband. When I moved back to my parents' house, my husband, who lived nearby, had seen me with my ex-husband. So even after all these years, he knew who this man was. With a soft reply and a nod to the two of them, he took our 3 kids and left. Then, my ex-husband, who had been silent until now, started muttering as if he couldn't hold it in.
Can't be.
For him, it must have been unbelievable. Clearly, his face turned pale. I knew what that expression meant but didn't address it. If he wanted to know, he could ask himself. While I said I wanted to talk a bit more with the kids, my ex-husband, unable to hold back any longer, blurted out.
What does this mean?
What does what mean?
That. Just now. They're my family, what about it?
I cut him off and answered plainly. That's what he wanted to know, right? Glancing over, I saw the shocked woman and my ex-husband with a contorted face. It was just as I imagined, and I couldn't help but laugh to myself.
You weren't single?
You just assumed that on your own.
Then you should have said something. Why should I tell you every detail, Mr. Shore? We just happened to meet here. There's no reason for us to meet or interact ever again. But still. And what's so strange about me having a family? I'm a 42-year-old woman, after all.
When I returned his earlier sarcastic remark, he bit his lip and looked away. I know exactly what the person in front of me wants to say. There's probably only one thing on his mind. He was bold enough to leave his wife for a mistress, but when it came to crucial moments, he was still a coward.
Something on your mind? Eh? Do you want to ask something? Huh? You look like it.
His eyes flickered, showing his unease, while the woman beside him looked puzzled. If he couldn't ask, I'd tell him myself. Smiling at them, I said, both of them, Tyler and Emily, are my kids, born from me. Aren't they lovely? They look like me and my husband. I told them clearly and directly. My ex-husband froze, unable to process or say anything. It was the woman who reacted first.
Wait! Weren't you infertile? Jumping right to the heart of the matter, I see. But...
One thing I never confirmed back then. So, my ex-husband had told this woman about the fertility treatments. But his understanding was selfish and far from the truth.
I'm sorry, but I can have children. Eh? Did Mr. Short tell you I was infertile? You were going to fertility treatments, right?
His one-sided assumption and conclusion. Even the fertility treatments we attended together, he thought of it as your fault. I almost sighed at the revelation.
Unfortunately, I've had tests at the gynecologist, and it's been proven. Besides, I've been pregnant twice already, so there's really nothing to prove at this point. No way. It's true. So, our compatibility was just really bad?
What's the point of asking such a thing now? It's a creepy question with no real answer, and I completely ignored it. Then the woman bit back.
You're really telling the truth, right? What? You could have just adopted kids or something.
So, after compatibility, now it's about adoption. I don't really care, but I need to make this clear.
You're welcome to inquire at the gynecologist I visited, or even do a DNA test with my kids. I don't have any problem with that. What? Should I introduce you? Huh? After I divorced Mr. Shore, I started dating my current husband and married him 6 months later. We had kids soon after. So, my eggs are actually super healthy. I even got a stamp of approval from my gynecologist. Introduce what? What? Why do I have to be introduced to your gynecologist by you?
The woman's face twisted as she snapped back. My words had hit a nerve with this simple-minded person.
Well, you don't have a second child, right? What? Mr. Shore always said he wanted 3 kids, so, should I introduce you?
They probably never imagined someone like me would say something like that. Both were speechless, frozen in place. Whether they didn't intend to have another child or couldn't, it was clear from their reactions. Their faces, previously contorted, quickly became docile. So, may I ask you something? I said, and they just turned their eyes towards me, still frozen. Whether they were wary or something else, well, that's none of my business, but I was about to confront a suspicion I had been carrying alone for over 10 years.
There's something I've been wondering about for a long time. What is it? Can I say it?
Their wariness intensified. Struggling to keep a straight face, I calmly said to them,
Is that child really Mr. Shore's? What? That child, is he really Mr. Shore's son?
It's important, so I said it twice. Those seemingly casual words turned out to be a massive bombshell. The woman went pale without a word, and my ex-husband's face turned bright red in anger.
What? Are you kidding me? You heard it too, didn't you? He's my child. The child Jennifer and I made with love, I told you that before.
He started shouting again in the middle of the outlet. Given the nature of the topic, we drew a lot of stares. The woman, either embarrassed or wanting to escape, quickly hid behind my ex-husband.
Of course, I heard that. More than enough. Then. But you see.
As my ex-husband tried to deny my words, I quickly interjected.
I had to deny that because I know it's not true.
My ex-husband, looking puzzled, probably couldn't even imagine what I was talking about. I briefly reminisced about the final days of our marriage, where such confusion was the norm, and felt a thin veil of emotion cloud my vision. It's not that I felt sad anymore, but recalling those days when I carried everything on my own made me feel a bit vulnerable. Shaking off that brief moment of weakness, I faced them again.
Huh? What does that mean?
Well, it's kind of late now.
What are you talking about? Should I say it? Just spit it out. Hurry up, you crazy woman.
His insults, so familiar, made me wonder if that's all he knew.
Yeah, I was just trying to be considerate of you, Mr. Shore. Huh? If you really want to know that you're infertile, I can tell you in great detail.
At my words, my ex-husband looked completely stunned, and the other woman let out a silent scream. As expected, all the color drained from her face.
What's the matter? I thought you wanted to know. Why the shock and loss of color? What's wrong?
I spoke a bit louder, deliberately, as the two of them grimaced. Well, of course. He left me for Jennifer because she had his child, but if he's infertile, it completely turns the story on its head.
Hey, you're kidding, right?
His voice was barely a whisper. He would want to think so, but facts don't change. I enlarged an image on my phone that I'd kept just in case a day like this would come and showed it to them.
This is Mr. Shore, remember? The test you took during our fertility treatments. Ah.
He probably didn't remember. Or had denied it so much it was erased from his memory. My words must have jogged his memory. He glanced down briefly, showing a bitter expression. Back when we were undergoing fertility treatments, the doctor had suggested testing the male side as well. But my husband, who blamed me for our inability to conceive, was not enthusiastic about it. However, he couldn't refuse a strong request from the doctor. In a way, his cowardly nature was a blessing then. But eventually, before the results came out, Jennifer's issue surfaced, and he left me. I ended up hearing the results alone.
The doctor was kind, and I couldn't just ignore it after the divorce. I was shocked when I went to hear the results. Mr. Shore was infertile. After all, shortly before, he came to report that they had conceived a child and left me. Was a natural reaction, right?
Right, Jennifer. The woman, called by her name for the first time today, struggled to compose her frozen expression. My ex-husband, fixated on the phone screen, turned to look at the pale-faced woman and asked curtly,
"Did you lie to me?" Did you lie to me? Well, that's... If I'm infertile, I can't have children. Now that I think about it calmly, we only had intimate relations properly once before the supposed pregnancy. And even then, we used protection. Every other time, I was too drunk to even finish. So, even if I wasn't infertile, the chances of us having a child together were practically zero.
Right? He looked at me, as if seeking confirmation. I didn't affirm or deny, just silently observed them. Taking my silence as confirmation, he let out a heavy sigh and a click of the tongue, scratching the back of his head in frustration. Then Jennifer suddenly became defiant. But that's how it was made to look.
Huh? What do you mean?
Both my ex-husband and I questioned Jennifer, overlapping our voices in confusion. Facing us, she began to speak with an air of enjoyment.
I was really living it up back then. I had countless flings and one-night stands, you know. I was 20, so you get it, right? That phase of enjoying good times with attractive men? Well, it's not my fault I was so popular.
She even started laughing by herself, leaving my ex-husband and me speechless, simply listening to the words pouring out of her eager mouth.
I was so carefree, never got pregnant no matter how much I did it, so I gradually let my guard down. Sometimes, if it felt too good or I was just lazy, I went with the flow without thinking. That kind of became the norm for me.
I could somewhat understand that mindset. At 20 or so, still new to such experiences, it's possible to get carried away or overwhelmed by pleasure. But that's also why contraception and protection from STDs are important. The thought of her being involved with numerous partners made me shudder. What if my ex-husband had caught something and then? Well, it's just a hypothetical, but the thought was chilling.
And, well, eventually it happened, I got pregnant. But even after I found out, I had no idea whose child it was. Around that time, I met Steve at the nightclub where I was working. He was 12 years older, decent looking, and a 32-year-old manager at a big company. You could see his bright future from a mile away. I decided he had to be the father, so I set my plan into motion.
The facts she recounted so nonchalantly were incredibly selfish, and the first thing that came to my mind was the innocent, puzzled face of the child I saw earlier. The thought of how his life could be affected by such adult selfishness was my only concern. As expected, my ex-husband said,
"Now that I know the truth, I can't stay with you."
It was a line that implied a looming divorce. His demeanor reminded me of myself 12 years ago. I had so many questions, but knew asking them wouldn't change anything. For the first time, I felt a twinge of sympathy for him. Of course, Jennifer started making a scene, accusing him of being cruel to their child. Once again, she was using the child as a shield to protect herself. But my ex-husband, having regained his composure from the whole conversation, was unswayed.
"Get a DNA test and find the real father. I'm not responsible for raising him." "What? DNA doesn't matter. You're Ken's legal father. We were married when Ken was born. You're the only father he has."
Jennifer was desperate, clutching at my ex-husband as her hands turned white from the strain. Yet, my ex-husband calmly removed her hand and stated the reality.
"Even if we're legally parent and child, that can be contested in court." "Why would you do that?"
My ex-husband, a law school graduate who once considered becoming a lawyer and worked in the legal department at his company, knew many lawyers personally. Being in such an environment, my ex-husband was, understandably, well-versed in law. I thought it was foolish of him to dismiss his wife and run off with a mistress, but knowledge indeed proves to be an ally in life. His tone was firm, using the law as his shield. Jennifer could only shout in response.
"After all this time? betraying your own son who adored you as his real father.
What did you say?
You're betraying your own dear son, aren't you? The first betrayal was by you. Give me back my life. Give Ken back his life.
Their voices echoed again across the outlet plaza. My ex-husband, almost in tears, shouted that it wasn't just about him. Ken's life needed to be returned as well. Jennifer's betrayal wasn't just against him alone. He was facing the reality that it had also been inflicted upon Ken. He was confronting that fact, probably realizing his own actions had largely contributed to the situation. In the distance, in the park area, I could see the three children playing. They were laughing together so naturally, it was hard to believe they'd only just met. I felt a strong responsibility to protect these smiles.
Mr. Shore.
What?
Ken, right? He's cute, isn't he?
Of course. He's my son.
My son, huh?
Ah. Even after facing such a truth, those words came out naturally. To him, a life with Ken had become ingrained, a daily routine he took for granted.
Of course. You've been looking forward to his birth, and ever since he was born, you've always been together. Being a boy, he must have spent a lot of time playing with his dad, right?
Well, yeah.
That's great, then.
What?
Does the blood relation really matter?
That's... Probably, my ex-husband was starting to think about it. And I knew his conclusion would come soon. The problem was Jennifer.
What do you think about Ken? Huh? Ever since I met you, I wondered, with such long nails that seem impractical for housework, do you actually do any house chores or child rearing? Well, Ken is so attached to Steve, he does most of the care. Plus, I'm super clumsy, so before things get worse, Steve does most of the housework, you know.
Ah, I see. My ex-husband had indeed become Jennifer's convenient man. No wonder she wouldn't consider divorce, no matter what happened. Even if she had a child by chance, she knew she could return to the same lifestyle after giving birth.
So, what do you do all day? Hang out with friends, go drinking, stuff like that? You were really just looking for a money bag and a convenient house husband, weren't you? That's what I said, right? I worked hard to make sure I got him. I'm so lucky Steve is such a good guy. Enough already.
My ex-husband abruptly cut off Jennifer's continuous talk and then, tightening his expression, said,
I'm divorcing you, and I'll take Ken with me.
He announced his intention to involve a lawyer, confronting the now uproarious Jennifer. This is fine. Ken's smile will surely be protected. On Sunday, the kids were playing games in the living room. I heard them call out Ken's name.
Ken's online. Let's invite him.
Tyler had exchanged game IDs with Ken that day and had since been playing and chatting online. Through Tyler, I learned that my ex-husband had divorced Jennifer and she had left. Concerned that Ken might be downcast since his mother left, I learned that there hadn't been much change for him. His father was often out for work on weekdays, and his mother was rarely home, so it wasn't so different for him. Furthermore, I heard that sometimes when Ken returned from school, he would find unfamiliar men at home with his mother. It seemed likely that she had been using my ex-husband as a financial resource and a house husband while seeking new relationships outside. She probably took advantage of the situation to divorce and move on with another man. Hearing about Jennifer's unbelievable lifestyle recently, I realized people don't change easily. This reality might seem very cruel to Ken, especially in black and white. But in fact, I think this might be for the best. The reality is Ken's voice, coming from the gaming console, sounds very cheerful.
Thanks for letting them exchange IDs that day.
I said to my husband, seated across from me, who smiled warmly at the sound. It was my husband who naturally accepted Tyler's request in the park.
Yeah, they seemed really happy. But I'd rather not get directly involved with your ex-husband. Of course, I feel the same. But I do believe his love for Ken is genuine. Yes.
My husband smiled warmly. In fact, it was my ex-husband who was eager for children when we started fertility treatments. He has always loved children, and there's no doubt he was doting even before Ken was born. Him raising Ken with deep affection, regardless of blood ties, would surely make Ken's days happier. I'm confident that if the day comes when they have to face the truth, those two will be okay. For some reason, I feel sure about it. And as for me, I can't help but worry about Ken in the back of my mind. Knowing the kids are connected online, I can get a glimpse of how he's doing and feel reassured about his safety when he's home alone. I'm sure my husband feels the same way. We may never intersect with their lives again, but the children live in a different world. I hope these kids can always spend their days with smiles, listening to their lively conversations in the living room. Even though I called so many times. Don't mess with me. What are you doing? On the night of our wedding, my husband George said he was going out for drinks with an old friend and left. I trusted George and married him, yet he was betraying me behind my back. Moreover, after this, the worst betrayal will be discovered. I will never forgive you. Kelly. Were you watching me? That's creepy. Who's creepy? I'll send those words right back at you. The moment I heard from my father, I lost all my love for George. I'll corner him and destroy him. My name is Kelly, I'm 26 years old. I work in New York at a retail store. I've always loved fashion, so I enjoy my job. I still think I'm young at 26, but recently there's been a big change in my private life. I finally tied the knot with George, whom I had been dating for 2 years. We registered our marriage and had the wedding I always dreamed of. We met through a friend's introduction. I love male pop singers, especially the main vocalist in a certain group. I loved him so much, I talked about him everywhere. Then a friend said she knew someone who looked just like that guy. I was so excited, I begged to meet him. When we arranged to meet, I was nervously waiting. George, who would later become my husband, showed up. George is 10 years older than me. He was 34 at the time. He worked at a food company in sales. The moment I saw him, I fell for him. He was like a grown-up version of my idol. George probably didn't mind being admired by a girl 10 years younger. We started dating in no time. I knew I was a bit naive and dreamy. When I was introduced to George, I was completely charmed by his mature aura. I thought he would protect me if we got married. But as I dated George, I started to feel he wasn't the man I had imagined. I thought about breaking up several times, but in the end, we decided to get married after 2 years of dating. I thought supporting George would be the best for me. George trusted me, and I thought he would change his mind after marriage. Surely, he would become more responsible when we had children. I decided to trust George. Also, my father, living in the countryside, was very worried about my future as his only daughter. My mother passed away from illness a long time ago, and my father doted on me, his motherless daughter. I was happy about his feelings, but I couldn't bring myself to have an arranged marriage with the men he suggested. After all, there was no guarantee of meeting someone like George. When we decided to get married, George said seriously, "I'll work hard to get your father's approval." I smiled involuntarily. George was indeed serious about our future. We would surely be happy. However, soon after I started dating George, something surprising happened. It started with a phone call while I was at work. I rented a car. "Let's go watch the sunset." I was taken aback. George was supposed to be at work. At 3 p.m., my store was open. "Are you off today?" I asked permission from my supervisor to go to the back room of the store. I asked him quietly, and he said he wasn't off. Apparently, he found a scenic spot on his way to a sales call. "It's a beautiful spot, let's skip work and go on a date." I was confused. With a new employee at work, I couldn't just leave early. When I said I couldn't do it today, George said regretfully, "Oh, well. I guess I'll grab a beer and head home." George always had a way of getting out of work, even when he couldn't. Naturally, he got scolded by his boss and lost trust from clients.
In the 2 years we dated, I wonder how many times George changed jobs. Every time a firing was discovered, we would argue. Can't help it. I just didn't fit with that company, he would say in response to my displeasure about him quitting again. He had a bad work attitude, often sneaking out during work hours to have fun and taking unauthorized absences. Despite all this, George never thought he was the problem. Besides, how many companies do you think there are in the world? Don't you get it? The more I switch jobs, the more likely I am to find one that's a good fit, he would say, deflecting with his nonsensical theories. Perhaps his pride couldn't take being lectured by someone 10 years younger. Furthermore, he started complaining about the apparel company where I worked as a sales associate. He was unhappy with the limited time off and salary, urging me to change jobs. But I was content with the time off I had to follow my idol and the salary I received. I think it's a nice job. I don't have any complaints, I explained, but he didn't seem to understand. He simply hated working, the epitome of the ant and the grasshopper type. I used to wonder why he owned so many high-end items despite his unstable employment. But we managed to date for 2 years because George was particularly kind after fights, which swayed me. Apart from his dislike for work, I thought he was a good person. With each date, my desire to not lose him to anyone else grew stronger. I asked George about getting married. Surprisingly, he agreed immediately. Sure. I'm 35, it's about time I settled down. And so, our marriage was set, and we visited each other's parents. George's family was a typical middle-class household. His parents seemed uninterested in him, ending the meeting abruptly. I was relieved to think we wouldn't be interfered with after marriage. But I also wondered if George's unreasonable behavior was a result of his parents' lack of interest. His casual attitude at work and tendency to lie might stem from not being cared for much by his parents. I felt a tightness in my chest. I felt sorry for George. Once we lived together, I would take good care of him, hoping he would change. When George first visited my house, he was surprised. It was an old, large, and formal house. My family held a certain status in the local community. I hadn't talked much about my family, only mentioning the absence of my mother. So, George probably never imagined we were wealthy. What does your family do, Kelly? My family had been in the transportation business since my grandfather's time, expanding it broadly. My father, too, had good business acumen and grew the company further. He worried about my future but never mentioned taking over the business. He supported my decision to leave town and work while enjoying my hobby. He had no particular conditions for my marriage, so he would probably be surprised by how quickly it was decided. We talked about all this on the train back home. George listened with sparkling eyes. So, marrying Kelly means I could become a president. Images of my grandfather and father, who worked hard every night, came to mind. President? I don't think that suits you, George. He was too busy for that, but George seemed more interested in the grand house than my words. Don't be silly. Nowadays, there are plenty of families struggling to find successors. I'll take over, he declared, winning over my father with his sales skills and charming smile. Kelly is an only child, after all. My father was pleased. He continued to talk smoothly about work. Actually, I've been headhunted. I'm planning to switch jobs for a better offer than my last company. It was a lie. Even after deciding to get married, George seemed ready to quit his job again. Despite hours of convincing and seeing some change in his attitude, it seemed he still intended to quit. I felt a wave of exhaustion. Meanwhile, George talked excitedly about his new job, with my father nodding in admiration. But it was all a lie. There was no headhunting, no new company, no better offer. I suddenly felt scared by how easily he lied. But thinking that George really wanted to impress my parents, I felt I should support him in becoming a decent member of society. Since that day, George never missed a chance to suck up to my dad, trying to take over the family business.
He often called my dad, saying things like, "At 35, I've been offered a managerial position. They're saying I'll be promoted to department head in just 2 years. Can you believe it?" After he hung up, I confronted him. "Don't lie to my dad." But George looked at me displeased. "Why not? It's better for your dad to think he has a successful son-in-law. What's wrong with making parents happy?" It was all lies. It's impossible for him to be happy with that. As I was about to argue back, George brushed it off. "You'll see, I'm amazing when I really try. Just watch." Then came our wedding day. After much consideration, we decided to have it in my hometown. I was dressed in a beautiful, pure white wedding gown. Finally getting married and starting a family with George. It was a strange mix of happiness and nervousness. George arrived in his tuxedo. And we received blessings from colleagues, friends, and family. The guests on George's side also clapped and smiled. It was the best feeling. The wedding and reception ended. We had a room in the hotel at the venue. We were leaving early the next morning for our honeymoon in Guam. I chose the destination. A place I'd always wanted to visit. It was George's first time going abroad, and he seemed excited. The ceremony was amazing. I was thrilled when my favorite song played during the candle service. As I sat on the bed and took a deep breath, I noticed George was fidgety. "The after party? Starts at 6, right?" There was an after party planned following the wedding. My colleague and George's old school friend took charge of organizing it. We had reserved an ethnic restaurant near the hotel. "It'll be fun." George got up distractedly. "I'm going outside for fresh air." Something felt off. But at the after party, surrounded by old friends, George seemed his usual self again. When I mentioned his earlier restlessness, he laughed it off. "I'm just nervous about my first overseas trip." I was nervous too. I have a fear of heights, so spending nearly 4 hours on a plane was a bit worrying. But I intuitively knew he was lying. The after party ended. George, who should have returned to the hotel, lingered at the venue. When I approached him, he told me to go back first. "I'm gonna grab a drink with mates. You can go on and sleep." He's still drinking? I was surprised. Maybe he was really nervous about the trip and trying to distract himself with alcohol. I decided to rely on him during the trip. "All right. Have a good time." But later, I found out George was with his ex, Diana, who had attended our wedding. They disappeared into the night. Around 10 p.m. I was fast asleep from the day's fatigue when the phone rang. It was George. "I called so many times. Don't mess with me. What are you doing?" He was angrily lashing out. I had just woken up and was confused. "We're surrounded by some weird people. They're all calling your name. What's that about?" I heard a knock at the door. "Someone's here, hold on." I hung up and went to the door. My phone showed a history of missed calls from George. My dad was standing outside. Seeing my father's stern expression, I knew something was wrong. "Kelly, there's something important. Come with me." I instantly knew it wasn't good news. My heart raced. I didn't want to know. But my father's face was tense and serious. Actually, at that moment, all my trust in George vanished. It was more than a shock. I finally understood the meaning of familiarity breeds contempt. We arrived at a hotel near the next station in my father's car. There are several hotels in the area, but this one is managed by my father. There was a crowd at the front desk, surrounded by employees in hotel uniforms. In the middle of the crowd stood George and an unknown woman. George started yelling when he noticed me. "Kelly, were you spying on me? That's creepy." "Creepy? I'll send those words right back at you." The moment I heard the story in the car, all my love for George disappeared. I was determined to bring him down completely. My father sharply interrupted George's words. "These are our employees.
How dare you betray Kelly like this? George turned pale. What? All of them are employees. Apparently, this is what happened. George had spotted his ex-girlfriend among the classmates at the wedding. He easily made a promise with her during the after-party. Then he lied about going drinking with friends to send me home first. He checked into this hotel without knowing it belonged to my father. It might not have been discovered. But my father was so happy about my marriage that he live-streamed my wedding in all the company's employee cafeterias. What? Live-streamed? I didn't know. That's embarrassing. I blushed, and my father, sweating profusely, apologized. Sorry, I was just too happy. While many employees congratulated us, it was quite a display of parental pride. I muttered how awkward it would be to face everyone now. However, my father insisted that this live stream helped us discover George's misdeed sooner. The hotel front desk man, who had seen the live stream, was shocked to see the new groom, who just married the boss's daughter, checking into the hotel with another woman on the night of the wedding. Though he let them into their room, the front desk was in an uproar. The employees debated whether to inform the boss. During their discussions, about 2 hours passed. George and the woman emerged from the room. The employees, determined not to let them leave, surrounded George. Panicked, George called me frantically. It's all out in the open. What are you thinking? Treating my precious daughter like this? My father, a former rugby player with a powerful voice, stood imposingly. George, always more delicate and gentle, was visibly shaken by his booming voice. No, it's a misunderstanding, or a mistake. His trembling voice was pathetic. It was clear he was trying to wriggle out of the situation. The ex-girlfriend looked at him with disdain. I had reached my limit. Who is that woman? My own husband is cheating right under my nose, and in front of my father's employees, no less. It was a huge embarrassment. Not only did he humiliate our family, but he also tarnished the company's name. I had forgiven him for his looks, but this was unforgivable. I will never forgive you. Seeing my furious face, George started making excuses. Kelly, you've got it all wrong. My ex-girlfriend, she forced me. Diana and I both exclaimed in disbelief, glaring at each other like furies. George seemed to have decided to blame it all on her, portraying himself as the victim. Stop lying. We've already seen the surveillance footage of you happily checking in. My father pointed out, making George flinch again. Were you planning to spend the night with another woman and then go on a honeymoon with me the next morning? How could you be so shameless? George was stunned, frozen by my direct accusations. I had never shown him this side of me before. An intense anger surged through me, more than I'd ever felt. Not only did he belittle me, but he also embarrassed our family to this extent. He was going to pay for this. In fact, the surrounding employees were utterly appalled. To think that such a happy wedding took place during the day, and by night the groom had already betrayed the bride. George nervously started to speak. Kelly, it's not something to be so angry about. We were just reminiscing about old times. I shouted back. Stop lying. I turned to my father. Dad, he's been going on about being headhunted and becoming a manager, but it's all lies. He was actually after your business. My father turned red with anger. What? I thought he was always too good to be true, this guy. Pressed by my father's imposing presence, George crouched down, holding his head. I'm sorry. Both my father and I looked at him with disdain, like one would look at an insect. He really was nothing but a pest who had crept into my life and our home. The employees around us whispered to each other about George's deceitful antics. He had fooled not only the president's daughter but the president himself with his marriage for money. It was a significant scandal we had stumbled upon. The employees didn't know how to react to the situation. He's a good-for-nothing, a freeloader who can't even do a proper job. Just because he's got a bit of a handsome face. I relentlessly exposed his secrets, and George looked like he couldn't believe what was happening. I thought it was just a phase or a bad past that my naive daughter brought home. I didn't even hire a private investigator when they decided to get married, thinking we could re-educate him. But I never imagined he would turn out to be such a scoundrel.
My father was disgusted, and I felt sorry for him. I should have consulted more with others. Choosing a marriage partner based on looks alone was a mistake. I really intended to reform George. The idea that love could fix everything was just a sweet illusion.
Well, it's good that we found out now. Divorce immediately.
George shouted in disbelief, "What?" and looked up with a sly smile, starting to plead.
Please, anything but that. What about me becoming your adopted son instead?
My father and I were dumbfounded. George, excessively humble and groveling, was truly disgusting. Why should we have to accept such trash into our family?
What? You have a problem?
My father smirked at him, indicating he knew everything. Realizing this, George looked down, ashen-faced. When I looked at my father in confusion, he spat out.
Turns out, this guy, George, racked up a lot of debt. He couldn't borrow anymore, so he married you so that he could start borrowing again.
My father had immediately started investigating George's background after receiving a call from the employees. In just a short time, the extent of his debts was revealed, and that's why my father was constantly checking his phone amidst this chaos. Everything went dark before my eyes. He even had debts. That's right. I remembered. All those high-end items. I worked in apparel sales and always used products from my company, but George always flaunted his bags and watches. So that's how he could afford them despite not working. He must have been secretly racking up debt. Perhaps he even reassured lenders, saying he was marrying the president's daughter. Such a despicable man.
You're beyond redemption. The more I learn about you, the more disgusted I become.
George looked at me with shrunken eyes.
Kelly, don't say that.
Tears forming. Suddenly, he began to cry and clung to my feet.
Kelly, you're all I have. You said you'd support me.
His sudden attempt to win sympathy through tears. But I coldly shook him off. He exaggeratedly fell to the ground, obviously pretending to be weak.
Why bother now? Ask your ex-girlfriend standing right there for help.
I pointed to the woman standing sullenly beside him. Until then, his ex-girlfriend had been almost silent, but now she spoke with utter contempt.
He told me he'd make me the wife of a president. He married you but had no love for you. He just wanted to use you to escape his debts.
George, still on the ground, shouted in panic. His act to gain sympathy was clearly abandoned.
That's a lie. Diana's trying to frame me. I love Kelly the most. She would never hurt me like this.
Still trying to deceive us. I was fed up. Do you really think you can continue to fool us like this? Are you an idiot? I shouted. Diana, the ex-girlfriend, gained momentum and began exposing more of George's low-life behavior.
He squandered a fortune on slot machines. I'm done dating a good-for-nothing like him,
she said, trying to leave as if she had no further involvement. My father stopped her.
Even so, we will be filing for damages against you. Don't leave just yet.
Diana turned pale.
I'm a victim too. I've been humiliated by all this,
she cried out hysterically.
If the law recognizes that, we might listen to you, but that's unlikely. You attended the wedding. You're nothing but a thief.
My father said. He asked the front desk man to keep an eye on Diana so she wouldn't sneak away. Meanwhile, George was also panicking. Upon hearing the word damages, he looked as if he never imagined such a situation would fall upon him.
Of course. We've just had a wedding and now a divorce. You're 100% at fault,
my father said, glancing at his watch.
Our lawyer should be arriving soon.
George suddenly apologized, rubbing his head on the floor repeatedly.
Please forgive me, I really don't have any money,
he pleaded desperately. But it was too late for such appeals.
My father and I looked down on him coldly. Watching George cry and flail like a child in front of everyone brought some relief to my anger. But I wasn't about to let him off easy. He deserved a complete downfall. Our lawyer was about to get to work. Prepare yourself, George. That night, George lost everything. He was hit with a huge demand for damages by our lawyer and was at a loss. We also told Diana she would have to make amends. "I've suffered enough because of you." She spat at George. George eventually went to his parents, begging for money. "Lend me some money, thinking I'd save you." His parents were shocked, having just celebrated their son's marriage, not understanding why he needed money. They had hoped to get financial help from us, knowing he married the president's daughter. But George quickly divorced due to his own doings. My in-laws immediately blocked his number and refused to shoulder his debts. George, with nowhere to turn, was left with debts and ended up on a fishing boat in the rough seas of Alaska. He better earn his keep. Life returned to normal for me after the swift divorce. Though deeply hurt by being seen only as a cash cow by the man I loved, I'm taking it as a life lesson. People around me know what I went through and are kind to me. I plan to focus on work and my hobbies for a while. My father's company became even more united after this incident. The employees feel proud of having saved the president's daughter, and there's a stronger bond among us. Sales have doubled, and a special bonus is planned. My father told me to take my time with marriage. This experience made me feel his deep love anew. I'm even considering joining my father's company to learn about business.